So today is the last day in the spring transfer portal window that players can enter the transfer portal. So I have no doubt we're going to have a lot to talk about tomorrow. But fear not, that doesn't mean we don't have anything to talk about today. And as some of you may have guessed, today we have got to talk about Coach Prime in Colorado. Because amongst this massive exodus the Buffaloes have experienced, Coach Prime is still stacking wins. And today we've got to break down and talk about the two newest additions, an offensive lineman and a defensive back. But before we can, as always, y'all know the drill. I have got to hear from you. Hop down to the comments, give me a Y for yes or an N for no. Are you excited about these two additions? And let me know what you're thinking. If you're new to the channel, be sure to subscribe. Hit that bell notification as I do constant college football content. You don't want to miss any of it. And if you enjoyed the content, be sure to like and comment down below. Those interactions seem small, but they are massive to content creators such as myself, and both getting picked up and maintained by the YouTube algorithm. And we're on a push to 20,000 subscribers. I'd love to have you a part of this unbelievable community. But having said all that, let's jump right into this. And of course, if you've been around the channel, you could have probably guessed we're going to start with the guy that you got out the transfer portal that plays in the trenches, because football is won and lost in the trenches, and I think any depth you can get to create more competition along the offensive line and defensive line is conducive to long-term success. And Coach Prime in Colorado were able to go into the transfer portal, get a former three-star offensive lineman who's transferring from the University of Florida in David Connor. And David Connor is an individual who stands 6'6". Now, one thing I love about this is not the only addition that Colorado has made on the offensive line out the transfer portal. In fact, David Connor gets to join a list that includes Jack Bailey, Savion Washington, Tyler Brown, Landon Beebe, and amongst some of those names, we have a Tyler Brown who comes from JSU. So Coach Prime already has a familiarity with him. You have a Savion Washington and a Jack Bailey that come from Kent State, where your new offensive coordinator, Sean Lewis, comes from. Savion Washington, by the way, reportedly stands 6'8", massive human being. So when you look at the fact that several of these offensive linemen have familiarity with coaches on staff, and the fact that you're able to create depth and continue getting additions along the offensive line, that's something I'm intrigued to see if they continue getting more pieces, because I think you can never have too much depth along your offensive line. Football's a physical game, injuries occur, and that's a position you need to have 6 to 7 guys you have faith in that can play any position along that line and can do so at a winning level. So super intrigued to see what Colorado goes forward and does along the offensive line, but one thing we need to understand, there are some additions they got in the recruiting class that could be big help, including an offensive lineman that comes from the junior college ranks who found himself as a top 30 player in junior college. So the offensive line is a position I'm really going to be watching closely for Colorado, because they've gotten some intriguing additions, and I'm interested to see what happens with the competition and what depth they're able to create from some of these additions, so super intrigued to see that. But now we need to move on to the defensive side of the football, where Coach Prime in Colorado continue strengthening this secondary. And if you asked anybody in college football right now what they were most excited to see on Colorado, I think you would excuse anybody whose answer was the secondary. Whenever you can look at a secondary and say, hey, the former #1 cornerback in the nation, Travis Hunter, he's on one side. The former #1 cornerback on the nation, Kermani McClain, he's on the other side. And around those two, we have blue chip guys who can play winning football. That's an intriguing secondary, one I cannot wait to watch. And they get another addition, this time Jalen Robinson transferring from the University of Alabama to Colorado. And this was a guy that was a top 300 prospect coming out of high school in the class of 2020. On top of that, he's a rangy cornerback. We talk about this on the channel some. Jalen Robinson stands 6'2", and anytime you can get a defensive back that has that ranginess to it, it's intriguing for these defensive coordinators, especially with receivers now. There are receivers who are 6'3" with legitimate long speed and the ability to go up and get contested catches. So defenses, if they have the ability to go out and get a 6'2" cornerback with ranginess, the ability to cover both smaller wide receivers and bigger wide receivers, why wouldn't you do it? That's why when Robinson entered the transfer portal, I didn't expect for him to be in the transfer portal long, and lo and behold, he wasn't. On top of the ranginess, on top of him being a former top 300 prospect in the nation. One thing we also need to understand is Robinson was coached by Nick Saban. Nick Saban is known as a DB guru, and anytime a defensive back from Alabama hits the transfer portal, it's probably likely that they're not going to sit in the portal long. And the cherry on top of all of this for Colorado is who Colorado's new defensive coordinator is. We can talk for days about how compelling it is that these defensive backs get to work with Coach Prime, and that is so compelling. Getting to work with a guy that was a Hall of Famer at your position, a guy who understands it as well as anybody and was as electric as anybody that's ever played the game at that position, that's got to be a compelling factor. But what's the cherry on top for Robinson in particular is that the Colorado Buffaloes defensive coordinator, Charles Kelly, is a guy he worked with, as Charles Kelly was the safeties coach for the University of Alabama before becoming defensive coordinator at Colorado. So for Jaquez Robinson, not only do you get to work with Coach Prime, but you get to work with a coach you have familiarity with already in the building in Charles Kelly. And I think that was a compelling factor for Jaquez Robinson. I think this is a phenomenal addition to this secondary, and like I talk about, anytime you can create depth through the transfer portal, that's an interesting scenario because we see teams be able to get starters out the transfer portal, but being able to get guys that add in depth out the transfer portal, well, that's one of the intriguing things that Coach Prime is doing. And we've seen coaches in rebuilds do this, but not to the extent we've seen Coach Prime do it. And I already talked about this in a video the other day. If you haven't seen it, I'm not going to repeat everything. I'll link it at the end. That way you can go watch it to get my full take on the mass exodus from Colorado and why I'm both not surprised and not concerned. I'll link that here so that you can go watch that. But at the end of all of this, these are two great additions for the Colorado Buffaloes, and I don't expect this to be the last two additions they make. Today is the last day individuals can enter their name into the transfer portal, but Coach Prime in Colorado can still pull players that are already in the portal after today. And there are two names that I'm going to be watching closely in relation to Colorado in the transfer portal, and I'm not saying it's only relegated to these two names. It certainly isn't. These are just two names that really jump out at me. First and foremost is a name that's going to surprise nobody, and that's Shiloh Sanders, who just graduated from JSU. First and foremost, congratulations to all the graduates, but now that Shiloh Sanders is entering the transfer portal as a graduate transfer, I think the natural inclination is for us to assume that he's going to Colorado, because why wouldn't you? I think he'd be a great addition to the Buffaloes, so that's the first one I'm watching. But the second one is Alton McCaskill, a running back that played for Houston, and this was a guy that burst on the scene as a true freshman, accounting for just over 5 yards a carry and just under 1,000 yards in his freshman season. He sat out last year due to injury, but this is a very talented running back, a very dangerous running back when he has the ball in his hands, and I'm super intrigued to see where he goes. And we've talked about some of the additions in this Colorado running back room. You have Dylan Edwards, who is so explosive, but then you also go and get Cavassier Smoke, an addition I talked about that I thought was going to be so much fun when paired with a Dylan Edwards whenever you go watch this Sean Lewis offense that runs at a breakneck speed. But if you can go out and get an Alton McCaskill to add into that room, that's going to be a really fun room, a really dangerous room, and a room I will be very excited to watch. But I'm really excited to hear from all of you. Hop down to the comments. Let me know what you're thinking. Let me know the additions outside of Shiloh Sanders and Alton McCaskill you're watching for the Colorado Buffaloes. I know there's also an offensive lineman from Houston. That would be an amazing addition, only adding in more depth, which is conducive to long-term success. We can talk on and on about this, but I can't wait to hear from y'all. We'll talk more tomorrow about some of these moves out the transfer portal. Until then, hop down to the comments. Let me know what you're thinking. That's it. See ya.